Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad, and I'm here with my podcast, Capitalism Hits Home. And what we're really trying to do here is show the reach of capitalism's long fingers into every aspect of our lives, our personal relationships, our sexual relationships, our images of class, of gender, our emotions, and all the intersecting aspects of our personal lives and our interpersonal lives. We aim to educate and activate and hope to inspire you to look at capitalism and to evaluate whether this is the best system for you or not. Of course, we hope you decide or not, but we're trying. In any case, this program has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. What I want to talk about today is identity politics, because identity politics are the politics of identifying as a woman, identifying as a Black person, identifying as an Asian person, all of the identities that are peddled. And on the one hand, that can be enormously psychologically liberating. If you are in one of the groups that is labeled, let's say, labeled as women, you are acculturated in a certain way. And part of the way you're brought up is the expectation that you will serve men. You will serve a man as his wife. You will be in charge of the domestic arena and the emotional arena, the social arena connecting your man with friends, with relatives, with his children. You'll be the social director, and you'll have those unexplained, unarticulated responsibilities. And your life will be to serve him. Now, this is all on an unconscious level. This is a gender role that people learn under the title women. You are to be subordinate to men. You are to be pleasing to men. You should look pleasing to men. You should look sexually attractive to men. And yet you should not be flattered by or interested in the catcalling you get or the evaluations you get from loitering men on the street or the appropriating glances you get from men at your work. It's interesting that Governor Cuomo, who bullies everyone in his office into servitude, bullies the women sexually, not only by occasionally feeling them up, that's more aggressive, but also by calling them hun or baby or commenting on their clothing, that they should wear heels. That was part of the discipline of women at Fox News, that they sat at glass desks so their legs could be visible. And they were to be sexually attractive and blonde, without that being in the contract. When a man on the street says, smile, smile, honey, what are they saying? Please me, some random guy on the street? Why should you? Because your gender role tells you that part of that gender role is a kind of subordination to the needs of men. And then what identity politics does for women, and this is a parallel process for all groups that are taught that they are to somehow be subordinate and serve, is it says, no, we reject that subordinate role. We are people in our own right. Our lives matter, as in the case of Black Lives Matter. We are fully human. There is a definition of feminism that feminism is the radical idea that women are full human beings, that we are fully human. And that's a message that we don't really get growing up. And it's a message of subordination. So the man's needs come first. So women who make more money than their partners, which is about 39% of women before the pandemic, earn more than their partners. And those women overwhelmingly do more housework to compensate men with extra domestic service because men can't perform their oppressive gender role of being the providers for the family. These roles are taken in psychologically and acted out without awareness. And for women, it's that our role is to serve. And most jobs for women, 43% of the jobs, are pink collar jobs where we serve as waitresses or barmaids or bartenders or nurses under the direction of doctors or nurses' aides under the direction of nurses and doctors and hospital administrators who are overwhelmingly male. We are to serve the patient's needs. We're there to make them feel better, both physically and emotionally, or we're in other trades that usually serve. We're home health aides, the overwhelming majority, that serve in caring roles because part of our serving is caring for the elderly. And women internalize these roles. It's not only men who internalize that that's women's roles, it's women who do. And our identity as women becomes wrapped up with service to men and service to children. Identity politics, what was originally the women's liberation movement and now the feminist movement, says you don't have to serve. You are a full human being. You are an equal. You can join any job that men are in. You can be at the top of any field. You don't have to please. And that is enormously liberating, psychologically liberating. By the same time, if you're a Black person, you're trained by all the things in the society to think of yourself as less good. You're in the less impressive roles in the media. You're portrayed often as criminals. You live in poorer neighborhoods, which give you a sense of shame. And then the Black liberation movement, Black power, which is utter identity politics, painting whites as the enemy, just as Gloria Steinem femininity paints males as the enemy and says we don't need them. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. That separates us out and gives us a sense of power as a group that is united against subservience, which is an inner quality as well as an outer quality. And the Black Lives Matter and a Black identity worn proudly rejects that inferior identity of servitude. I remember a colleague of mine and a friend who was Black came from a very fancy family in the South. They were so rich that even though they weren't allowed to go into a white storekeepers came to their mansion so that they could try on the clothes. And when she went down south to visit her grandmother, who was in a very elegant house in a Black segregated neighborhood, and they came over to try on shoes for her, she said, "Oh, these are not this and that is not that." And the salesman said, "Where did she come from?" Because it was obvious that her sense of self did not belong in the southern town where she was to act subservient, even though she was in a wealthy person's house. Those identities are both empowering and also easily exploited. And one of the many identities that people have has not been explored in identity politics. And that's the identity as a worker, the identity as an employee. Because if we look at the divisions in society, They're not only the gender divisions between men and women, with their hints of subordination and domination, or the divisions of black and white, or people of color and white people. They're also the big division of employer-employee. In the beginning of the society, those divisions, well, in the beginning of society, there was primitive communism and not these divisions. But later on, there were the divisions between master and slave. The master, like the pharaoh, was in command. The slaves did the heavy lifting. And the overseers, hired by the master, oversaw the work of the enslaved. Later, there was the serf and the lord, where the lord was the owner and prime manager and prime exploiter of the serfs on his manor, and they knew to be subservient. After serfdom fell and capitalism was established, new lines of dominance and submission were drawn, and those were the lines of employer and employee. And yet Americans haven't been taught in identity politics that you identify as a working class person or as an owner or a manager. We're all supposed to be middle class, and the identity is middle class, someone who is in the middle, who has prosperity, whose children will do better than she or he, who will have a home, or identify as the impoverished, those who live under worse conditions in the worst neighborhood, those whose kids don't get good medical care, those who can't qualify for the better jobs because they've gotten an inferior education and possibilities. Those identities have been suppressed in our capitalist society. And yet they're very powerful. They're as powerful as the identity as a woman, or as a woman who is supposed to be subservient, or as a black person or other person of color who is supposed to be subservient. And the discovery that we are in the same boat and that we don't have to be subservient and that we need to be empowered is powerful. However, the identity that is neglected in all of our very multiple identities, and identity politics reduces us to one identity: female, black, person of color, Hispanic, lesbian, and so on. But never, I am a lesbian, I am a woman, I am also a worker, or I am also an employer. And the lines are very carefully drawn, but psychologically drawn. Althusser, who was one of the great Marxian philosophers, probably at least in my mind, the greatest of our era, he died in 1980. He had an essay, which anybody could get on the internet, called Ideological State Apparatuses. And what he said is that there are these apparatuses that let us know whether we are to be submissive or dominant, whether we are in charge or whether we are working for others. And those are the family, where you're taught to obey and be submissive to these adults and taught how you are to relate to those from the outside. The authoritarian church, where you're supposed to submit, and also the lines are drawn so that the pictures of the saints in the feudal church had the faces of the feudal lords and ladies on them, and how the church benefits by the huge gifts which are commemorated in the church, thanks to this one and that one who so generously donated this particular altar or this particular prayer room or these particular paintings. And you learn to obey unless you're in the class of people who learn to rule. An authoritarian education, so that the education that you get if you're at an elegant private school, like Sidwell Friends, where Obama's children went and Biden's grandchildren go, or St. Andrews, where Trump's child went, you are taught that the teachers are there to serve you. You are not to just to obey the teachers. And where you're given very small classes, so 6 or 8 kids will go to robotics class or computer class, while others are getting specialized physical instruction in fencing, which they offer, and other sports that public schools don't offer. And those schools cost on an average of $53,000 a year for tuition. And that doesn't count your books and the half a year you're off on vacation. And so that those children are taught to obey. There's a wonderful set of studies by Hess and Shipman in which they ask Black middle class and upper class parents, and also Black working class parents, the same questions. They gave them with their children an Etch-a-Sketch and asked them to draw a picture. And the people at the top who were wealthier tended to tell their children, well, if you move, let's see, move it this way, it does this, move it oh, good. Whereas the people at the bottom would tell their kids, do this, do that. The same thing around discipline, where the people at the bottom would tell their kids, no, do this. Whereas the ones at the top would say, if you do this, that might happen. Teaching their kids about consequences and treating them with greater respect, not always with respect, but with greater respect, the respect that their governesses and nannies treated them. Whereas the children of the poor, whose parents advised them on the first day of school, would say, you be good now. If the teacher tells you something, you do it. I don't want to hear you've been bad. Whereas the people at the top would tell their children around the first days of school, the teacher is there to help you. If you have a question, ask it. Her job is to teach you, not your job is to obey. And these are the subtle messages that kids get about their status in life. And those statuses as working class overlap with the status of race or gender, but they're every bit as powerful. And yet they're not included in the identity movements at all, because those movements are often exploited by the capitalist class to sell you a product, to sell you that the idea that Black is important, but not look at why don't you feel as good? Is it because you're working at McDonald's and getting minimum wage, where someone who doesn't work at all but owns stocks in McDonald's does so much better? Why do some kids have a nanny? And 75% of kids go home to an empty house when their parents work. Because before COVID, most women of young children worked outside the home as well. And so that there are these subtle class messages. John Lennon, the member of the Beatles, had a song called A Working Class Hero, in which he captured it. He said, as soon as you're born, they make you feel small by giving you nothing instead of it all. A working class hero is something to be. If you want to be a hero, just follow me. And he talks about the little indignities that go into identifying as a child of parents who have no money. The same thing is true of Joe Badgin's brilliant work. He wrote the bestseller Deer Hunting with Jesus, and he also wrote another novel, which is wonderful. I have to look on my shelf and see it. But it's Joebageant, and it's called Rainbow Pie. And it's about all the indignities that he suffered as a poor white kid in Virginia. A kid whose parents couldn't afford to send him to art school, even though he was so talented that the recruiter said, if I didn't have children to give to, I'd pay this child's way myself. But his father didn't have the money. It was only a few $100s at that time, but he didn't have it. And how other kids told him at school, look, act dumb and then drop out. That's what they expect of us anyway. And those are the ways that class is perpetuated, where the idea that if you don't have money, you deserve not to have money. And you can scrape and scrounge, but you're not going to be the boss. It used to be that whites could count on, if they were in a family headed by a white male, or if they were a white male, they could count on a family wage. That was true until the mid-70s, where it started to taper off. And so if you were a white male, at least you could be in command of your wife and children, no more. The majority of divorces are now initiated by women whose husbands can't support them anyway and who no longer want to be subordinate. And the majority of children grow up without 75% grow up without their two biological parents, but they grow up with these messages of what to expect and how to feel about yourself if you're the child of privilege, or if you're the child of no privilege, if you're in the oppressed neighborhood, if your parents can't afford much, and most of the people on food stamps in the United States are white. And what they do is they try to make it seem like a race issue, as if only brown people are poor. No, the majority of the poor in the United States are white. But they're supposed to feel a little superior, because poor people are, after all, black, not them. And those identity politics that eliminate the identity as a working person, a person who works for a living rather than who lives off of his or her wealth, are huge, powerful identities. It's those identities that have been behind social movements and socialist movements from the start. I've been reading an interesting book called Lucy Parsons, Goddess of Anarchy, where Lucy Parsons is a remarkable woman. She was born a slave, rejected her black identity, got educated through her first husband, who was black, left him, reinvented herself as a mixture of Native American and Mexican heritage, and headed the anarchist movement with her husband, Parsons, until he was hanged as part of the Haymarket revenge on working class people. But their ideology, not only the anarchists, but the socialists of the time, who were hugely numerous, had an identity in big rallies as working people, people who deserve to share the wealth that they have, not to be salaried workers for someone else. We forget because we don't learn it in history. In my lousy history that I learned every year at Public School 81, PS 81 in the Bronx, we never found out about this stuff. We didn't find out about the periodic depressions of 1873 with mass movements that followed, or the periodic depressions of 1893 that had huge labor movements and socialist movements that were followed by public hangings of innocent people, just like the big movements of the 1930s and the 1940s were followed by the 50s anti-communist crusade and the electrocution of the Rosenbergs. We didn't read about those patterns. We didn't read about those huge movements involving millions of people. We didn't even learn about the recent history of the Great Depression, where millions of people were organized and militant, where hundreds of thousands marched down Fifth Avenue in New York City, demanding jobs and income and housing. We didn't learn about the power of the union movement with the socialist movements and the communist movements of the 30s and 40s that pushed FDR to be able to say to his rich compatriots, "You'd better let me do this New Deal or you won't have your corporation anymore." And we didn't learn about the revenge that came afterwards and when FDR died, when they got rid of the communists and the socialists as fellow travelers and the union militants as well, because class identity has been even more suppressed in our era than has gender identity, which started to be challenged in the 70s, and race identity, which started to be challenged in the 50s. And it's time for us to challenge that identity as workers that makes us submit to conditions that are unfair and exploitative and doesn't say to us, you should own the place, you do the work. Now we're at the end of this podcast. I want to really thank Democracy at Work, which is available at democracyatwork.info, and ask you to support this podcast by giving money if you can on Patreon, and if you can't, we understand, but then publicizing it to your friends. And also I want to thank Brian Issam and Maria Carnamulla and Liz Phillips and the whole team at Democracy at Work that makes this possible. Our Twitter handle is Democracy at WRK, Instagram at Democracy at WRK. My website is www.harrietfraad.com. And I really want your feedback. I want your pros, your cons, your interests, your feedback on what you'd like to hear. It's so important to the work of Democracy at Work and to all of us. Thank you so much. Goodbye.